down to business.
That's the nectar of the gods, baby.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the #1 liquid-fueled and liquid-lubricated show on the interwebs. This is the Whiskey Musings broadcast, and I am your ever so humble host, Rick. So tonight I wanted to talk a little bit about something that has been proposed this week by our House of Representatives, DC Statehood. I kind of want to talk a little bit about maybe some of the history of how DC became to be. And why people are talking about things like constitutional amendments needed and so on and so forth. But before I get into that, I wanted to... I kind of like to, prep for the show by sitting and listening to music. And the music is a varied flavor. And I need you to understand, at least from a content creator's perspective, doing something like this, where you don't really have any kind of set show, you don't have a big group of people who are coming up with ideas, brainstorming ideas for shows. You don't have like an engineer who handles the sound. You don't have somebody who's handling the camera. You have, content creators, generally speaking, on YouTube. Not a lot of them are necessarily professionals, and they're individuals such as myself who are amateurs who are creating these creating all of this content for you to hopefully enjoy. And yes, I mean, some of them do make some money off of it, but there are others who don't, who are just doing it for the fun of it. And because they gathered something, they found something, like our friend Addie, she talks trials because she loves trials. She loves the actual court process. She loves seeing that. She doesn't sometimes love some of the court cases, but it's the process. It's the rigidity of it that is enthralling to her, I believe, and she's more than willing to go ahead and correct me if she's in the watching audience right now. But the thing about it is, about content creators, is we put a lot of time and energy and effort into these things, and so as a part of an appreciation for what we do, the best thing you can do is you can give a subscribe, or drop a like in there, hit the thumbs up button, those kinds of things. Maybe even if you happen to notice on a discussion page, talking about, maybe have some discussions, talk about that. If you like what the program is about, and then of course you can also spread it around. But I other than self-promotion, which is something that I do, I mean, I'll admit, I'm not going to deny that, but one of the things I did want to point out is doing this has actually given me an appreciation for things that are not quite the norm. And what I mean by that is, preparatory things that you don't see, things that go on in the background, that you really don't necessarily realize or appreciate when you see the final finished product, because you don't understand all of the work that goes into it. What am I talking about? I mean, other than myself and other content creators like this, what I am talking about is I am talking about the world of dance. And my daughter and wife are out at a dance competition. My daughter dances competitively, and what I don't think people understand, because a lot of people think of dance as, oh, that's just an activity. It's not really, something like a sport. They tend to dismiss it. And to be honest with you, having an outsider's view, but yet having a kind of being able to like peek into the window per se of the dance world, there is a lot of work that goes into these things. I mean, my wife and my daughter outside of the countless number of hours that my daughter spends trying to gear up for these things, practice and getting everything right and so on and so forth, her instructors and choreographers putting the dances together, getting the music ready. And then, of course, you have all of the support staff, like the most of the dance adults and parents that are in there helping out with costume changes and making sure that everything is just so, and that they have, all of their costumes, and that they have, the things that they need to do their hair and so on and so forth. These things are huge productions, even for like small shows and stuff. The amount of work that goes into these things doesn't change depending upon the show or the competition or whatever. So I just wanted to take a moment because I realized it. I was watching my daughter and her dance troupe, the Dance Project Northwest. They went ahead and did they had their competition this weekend. And, it's pretty incredible to take a look at the finished product, but understand some of the back end work that goes into these things. And I will never, ever, ever say that a dancer in any way, shape, or form is not some sort of an athlete. Because if you really break these dances down, these dances are, anywhere from 1.5 to 3 minutes long, could be a little bit longer, but they have agility, they have strength, they have flexibility, they have, they can go from being on the floor to jumping and leaping high within a matter of a few seconds. And all the while doing all of this, while trying to keep their balance and keep their arms straight and legs straight or whatever it is. I don't even understand like all of the scoring mechanisms, but I'm going to tell you, as being a dance dad, I will never, ever, 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 ever say that these dancers are anything but athletes. They may not be what you typically think of as athletes, but they definitely are athletes. And I have a high amount of respect and congratulations for those folks who have gone around and decided to drop everything in order to get into this world, this competitive dance world. The competitive anything really does take a lot of time and effort. So I just wanted to applaud them for what they were doing. Now, to get into what I'm going to talk about tonight. Before I do that, though, I want to reach out and say thank you to everybody who has subscribed. I do appreciate your attendance when you come here and watch the live streams, watch my shows afterward. If you don't catch the live stream, I do appreciate it. As always, if it weren't for people watching, I probably wouldn't be doing this necessarily. So thank you from the bottom of my heart to yours. I do appreciate every time, just taking a small amount of your time to listen to what I have to say. You may not always agree with what I have to say, but at least you're taking the time to look and listen. And I'm certainly hoping that I'm creating content that you find both entertaining and informative and useful from that standpoint. So moving on to tonight's topic. One of the things that happened this week was the House of Representatives went ahead and put a proposal together in order to provide statehood for the District of Columbia, the D.C. area. And as a amateur historian when it comes to American history, and I do use that term extremely loosely, just because of the fact it does fascinate me, but it's not something that is all encompassing and consuming in my life. I had to kind of take a look because I wanted to see what the District of Columbia actually means to the American system of government, and why it ended up being the way that it was, and why we are using it and have it basically the way that we do. I also wanted to kind of understand a little bit about how can DC become a state? Because there is implications that can come about due to the District of Columbia becoming a state. So in order to do that, we kind of have to take a look back into when our country was formed. Because as you may or may not know, the Washington, D.C. area was not our first capital. In fact, originally it was looked at as Philadelphia being the first capital because that's where, in 1775, 1776, where the Continental Congress came together, signed the Declaration of Independence, signed the final draft or final version of the Constitution, and of course formed our government was in Philadelphia proper. And there was several discussions in terms of where is the government seat of power going to be. Now, a lot of people look at, it being on the East Coast. It seems like it, you would think that it would be maybe towards the middle of the country, but you need to understand that during the course of events, that obviously it was the East Coast that was the first part of the 13 original colonies that then again became the states, and then we just sort of expanded across and through a bunch of history, and we can talk about all of that history lesson too. But in reality, Washington, D.C. didn't actually become Washington, D.C. until 1800. And that was when it was decided, the location was decided upon for this particular place to sit. So before I get into that, though, we need to understand what is the purpose of the District of Columbia. I mean, why is it that we have this little space that seems so odd when we have the rest of our states? You would think maybe we could just put it in a state. Well, the reality of it was when the framers got together and put together the Constitution. In Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17, the Constitution actually states that Congress by itself, and I'm going to kind of read a quote here, but it's a very long part of the Constitution. If you want to take a look at it, again, it's Article 1, Section 8, where D.C. actually comes into play, or the district, as it's known as a part of the Constitution, comes into play as Clause 17. So in the first article, it talks about the House of Representatives and the Senate, their makeup, their responsibilities, what they can do, what the government is basically going to do from a legislative standpoint. And one of the things that they outlined, that the framers outlined in the Constitution, was that Congress shall have the power to exercise exclusive legislation in all cases whatsoever over such district not exceeding 10 miles square as may, by secession of particular states and acceptance of Congress, become the seat of the government of the United States. So that is the actual phrasing in the Constitution. So first of all, what they did is they said, hey, we're going to create this district and it cannot exceed 10 miles square. And so this is the idea behind this was actually discussed in a few places, but one of the places that it was discussed is in the Federalist. Now, the Federalist was a paper back then where we got what is now known as the Federalist Papers. But the Federalist itself was basically a series of essays that were written by James Madison in particular, where he penned arguments to support the Constitution. Now, for those of you that may not understand American history very much, you have the Federalist Papers, and then you have what's considered the Anti-Federalist Papers. And what the difference between those two are is basically the Federalist was supporting our Constitution and supporting the parts in it, whereas the other side was the Anti-Federalists, and they were not in support of several of the items that were in it. And so, the back and forth between these two groups of individuals basically helped frame our Constitution. And there were some things where we're ceded, by ceded, I mean given up, and there was a give and take. There was a consensus that was brought in terms of the framing of the Constitution. And in the Federalist Papers, or the Federalist, number 43, James Madison explains the need for the federal district. And by the federal district, he basically outlined that not exceeding 10 miles square. And the purpose, honestly, was, and if you look at a lot of the background history of our country's founding, you'll notice that the states actually retain a lot of power in in opposition, maybe, or in contrast, I should say. Sorry, in contrast to the federal government. See, in our federalist system, the states actually have, in some cases, more power than the federal government does. And the idea here was, because of the states being formed, they didn't want necessarily one state to be all powerful over other states within the Union. The idea was to try and make it equal across the board, that no one state could actually become more powerful than any other. And they actually stepped this far enough to say, okay, we need to understand, in terms of federalism and in terms of the states themselves, we need to basically come up with a more of a neutral territory or a neutral ground where our federal government can reside. And so the idea was that, hey, we're just going to make this district. It's going to be a district city. And so this city essentially was what became, and the idea was to have a seat of power that was to be awed upon by foreign dignitaries and all of these other consensus, and then also make it so that the federal government won't actually be beholden to any particular state, no matter what state it was in. The idea here is to keep a balance, to keep a midway point for all of the states and everything else to not have any kind of advantage again. Now this was debated hotly. I mean, it was kind of back and forth in the Federalist Papers, but Federalist 43 is where James Madison really explains the need, and also explains that the Congress itself should have exclusive jurisdiction, and it needs to be separate from any territory or authority of any single state. And the reason for that, again, goes back to the idea that the states themselves, you don't want to have one over the other. Now, interestingly enough, the reason why this concern came up was because of the fact that prior to this whole idea of the states, this whole idea of the district being in place, before it was formed in 1800, and actually it goes back to June 1783, several hundred unpaid and angry Continental soldiers marched on Philadelphia, and they were menacing Congress in Independence Hall in Philadelphia by itself. Now, Pennsylvania, the state where Philadelphia resides, refused all the requests for the Congress for assistance. And after 2 days, Congress went ahead and adjourned. Now, that particular incident, and after they adjourned, the members of Congress, of the Continental Congress at the time, fled into New Jersey. Now, that incident in itself was used multiple times to argue that they needed a separate place for the federal government that is controlled by the federal government to be. And unfortunately, the incident itself, it was referenced many, many times by the framers, and it was part of their biggest defense in the provision for a federal town or a federal city. The anti-federalists, the people that were on the opposite side of the spectrum, they actually persisted in bringing up the point that having a town like that or a city like that could potentially visualize or create a sink of corruption and a potential place for tyrants to stay. Because if you think about this, the city itself is controlled by Congress. That's why we have the Capitol Police, who are actually beholden to Congress itself. They are under the Congress's jurisdiction. And so this is where this is where you start to get an idea of the framework, especially dealing with the January 6th riot in the Capitol itself, as to why there weren't other police forces in that area. Now, keep in mind, too, that the Army by itself cannot operate on American soil. It was designed that way, to where unless we're in war and we're having battles on our soil, we are, the Army by itself is not supposed to operate within the confines of the United States borders, which is why we have the National Guard. The National Guards are actually beholden to the states. It is an argument based off of the Second Amendment that's dealing with those National Guard are actually the militia, but I can go into that at another time. The big key here, though, is that the idea was to have a city that could be completely sovereign, controlled by itself, and needed to be separate from any other state. Now, the funny thing about DC was that it wasn't the first choice of everybody. In fact, the place where this capital city was going to be was actually more contested based off of history than the actual fact that we needed a separate place by itself. And there was a lot of back and forth, mostly looking at things like Philadelphia and New York. But eventually, they decided that what they would do is they wanted to bring it to another more neutral location rather than having it in the north versus having the southern states. So they decided to place it somewhere in between Maryland and Virginia, those two states. And both of those states gave up some of their land. In return, it would assume that the other states would assume those two states' Revolutionary War debt. And so anyway, it was sealed in a meeting between that particular piece of it was sealed between Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson, where the South got the capital, by the South meaning Maryland and Virginia, but the federal government obtained the economic prowess from it. Now, both Maryland and Virginia ceded the 10 miles square on their respective sides of the river, and the government was then formed as its permanent seat in 1800. Now, a lot of people talk about how the district is set up, and the district itself, the residents that are in the district, because it technically is not a state, they cannot elect members to Congress. Okay. And this is where part of the contention comes into play, because they don't have any kind of senators or representatives in Congress necessarily. And so what happened after a period of time, we ended up with the 23rd Amendment to the Constitution, which basically allowed the district the right to participate in presidential elections, because up until that point they hadn't done so. But they gave the district the right to participate in the presidential elections, but not in congressional elections. And the reason for that is fairly obvious to somebody who thinks about it. I mean, you could, in theory, elect somebody from that area who has power over that area. That could tend to be a little bit of a problem, or could potentially become a problem. You need to understand that during the framing of the Constitution, they had just the U.S. Had just gotten out of a very abusive and tyrannical relationship with the King of England. And so they built in, the framers built in a lot of ideas to try and check and balance power, so that not any one particular force could actually gain a foothold and turn into a tyrannical scenario, tyrannical government. So they built a lot of checks and balances in this case. But instead, what happened was with the 23rd Amendment is that it gave the right of the residents to elect non-voting delegates to the House of Representatives. So what you'll see is you'll actually see where there'll be delegates in the House of Representatives from the District of Columbia, but they can't vote as a part of the laws and that kind of thing. And sorry, I'm just kind of reading my notes here and catching up where I am. So anyway, the idea was that in forming the district and as a compensation, let's say, for the non-voting opportunities, what they did is they said, hey, but you're going to live in the capital city. I mean, it's going to be beautiful. It's going to be powerful. It's the seat of power. We want to exude power. And so that was something that they said was kind of a trade-off, okay, to the inhabitants. So Justice Joseph Story has a quote here, and he wrote this in the commentaries on the Constitution of the United States. And he says, quote, "There can be little doubt that the inhabitants composing the district would receive with thankfulness such a blessing, since their own importance would thereby increased, their interest be subserved, and their rights under the immediate protection of the representatives of the whole Union." So essentially what the framers felt was that the framers believed that the residents within the district were virtually represented in the federal interest in the idea of having a strong, prosperous capital. So they were going to receive the benefit of actually living in the capital city, is really where it kind of breaks down. And as a part of that was to not have the voting rights from a sense of being able to put a seat into Congress. Now, as I pointed out, the 23rd Amendment changed the idea of them not being allowed to vote in the presidential election. The 23rd Amendment allows them to vote in the presidential election, but they can't vote for senators. They can't vote for, they vote for a House of Representatives, but it's a non-voting member. Now, this proposal that's been put forth by the House of Representatives right now is not the only one. I mean, there have been efforts in the past, and one that actually got fairly close to actually passing into changing that design of having the district turn into like voting members, or even at one point turn it into the state. But the one time that it came close was back in 1977. Congress passed a constitutional amendment, a proposed amendment, that would have granted the District of Columbia congressional voting representation, quote, as if it were a state, unquote. Now, the problem was, or what happened, was that this amendment was actually not ratified in the 7-year period that was established by Congress. And by ratification, what that means is the 2/3 of the states need to ratify the amendment in order for it to actually become an amendment to the Constitution. So not only does Congress have to do it, and 2/3 of the Senate have to agree, the House of Representatives have to pass it. The Senate has to pass it with 2/3 represented, but also 2/3 of the states that are out there have to agree on this amendment in order to change the Constitution. And this is part of the reason why it seems like it's going to be one of those things where it's an uphill battle for the Democrats in particular to try and get this done. Okay. I think one of the biggest arguments that we can have with that is the original intention of the DC area to make it to where it can't become a state. I mean, it literally really shouldn't be. The original idea of it was to have a seat of power that was not beholden to anybody else, no one other than itself. And, I personally, I can find agreements with that. I can find this is a perfectly good explanation and reason as to why DC is separate from the states, from Virginia and Maryland. Now, Alexandria and Arlington County and the Virginia portion of the original territory of Columbia were the parts that were given over into the District of Columbia. And ironically, it wasn't. They kind of had back and forth about how the legal statutes and how law was going to be maintained in that area. And so what they did is they actually said, and I'm sorry, it's Washington and Alexandria. Those are the two counties. But the laws basically carried over from what was already there until Congress decided to change the laws. And that's basically how they started it from Virginia and Maryland. And they would the laws at the current time in those counties, in the states of Virginia and Maryland, whatever the laws were, would stay there until Congress decided to change them. Now, unfortunately, the original setup didn't allow for judiciary. So Congress did make a change and added things like justices of the peace to be appointed by the president. And over the last 2 centuries, Congress has actually experimented with different methods of rule within that space. And they've changed it from home rule, direct rule. I mean, just they've messed around with it because that's their area. That's where they can do these things. So in 1977, again, there was the amendment that was passed by Congress. It was actually passed through Congress, but didn't quite make it through 2/3 of the states within that 7-year period to create a new state. Now, other proposals have included, outside of making a state in D.C., other proposals have actually been where maybe the district can reform into Maryland. And this was it was a plan that Robert F. Kennedy, who was Attorney General at the time in 1964, he deemed that to be impractical and unconstitutional. As well as saying that the admission of Washington, D.C. to the Union as the 51st state was also such. So, realistically, if you think about this, taking and adding a frame to the district or adding a state to the country does require a lot based on constitutionality. And it requires a lot in terms of, both Congress and both houses of Congress, as well as the states. They need to bring these people in. And what you're going to hear potentially in terms of arguments for or arguments for this amendment is the fact that, the DC residents, they don't have proper representation. And actually there have been a couple of lawsuits that have ensued from this. And one of them is the idea, or one of them happened in the year 2000, where the courts actually rejected a series of arguments that suggested that the district's inhabitants were, based on various constitutional and policy grounds, entitled to voting representation in Congress without an amendment. This was a lawsuit. You can look it up. It's Adams versus Clinton in 2000 because Bill Clinton was the president at the time. The courts have also rejected some efforts to invalidate the congressionally imposed limit to tax in that area to tax non-resident commuters. But this is Banner versus the United States in 2004 was where that case came from. And in that case, the court basically said that, simply put, the district and its residents are subject to Congress's unique powers exercised to address the unique circumstances of our nation's capital. So, throughout history, the laws and lawsuits have popped up. So this isn't the first idea of creating DC into a state. and several parts and parcel of DC statehood, or the voting parts of the residents thereof, have been argued back and forth in terms of the courts. So, realistically, there's a lot of precedent that has been set that has basically shown that throughout the course of history that this whole idea of a separate district for our federal government to operate in has been supported over time. So, as much as I kind of understand, I mean, at least I can sort of understand, hey, the people aren't like voting anybody into the Senate. But at the same time, though, our founding fathers and the intelligence of people later on down the road thought that this is not something to really mess with. The idea is to make it, because we are a federalist system, we have separation of the federal powers and the state powers, and that the states have to remain their sovereignty, but yet operate within the framework of the federal government. Not so much that the federal government can have overarching power over everybody, even though sometimes that is the way that everything is believed. But realistically, it's think of it more as the federal government is the framework, the operational rules for states to actually deal with each other, and not so much being an overarching like command central, even though the federal government does have certain powers that it does have to do. Like, for an example, be able to lay taxes and to be able to raise an army in time of need. The object of the federal government overall basically is to operate and control the interoperability between the states and to defend the entire group of the United States toward the benefit of all. So it's not really designed necessarily to be a dictatorship or a tyranny. It is designed to actually help the states get along and work together. And this is really kind of what it's all about. Now, there's a lot of people who are out there who are thinking that, adding DC as a state is merely a political ploy. And to be honest with you, I kind of can see that too. I mean, I can really see it because of the fact that the District of Columbia traditionally has been a Democrat Party run area, that the Democrat Party tends to be a very strong presence within that space. And honestly, there's been some reflection of that if you look at the voting practices of the adjoining cities of like Alexandria, Virginia, for an example, where the city itself tends to vote more Democrat. So, by doing this, it actually gives the perception of going and trying to gain more power from for a certain political party. And this is exactly what the framers did not want. They did not want our federal government to be beholden to any one entity. That's what James Madison talks about, to have exclusive jurisdiction, to be separate from anybody, because it can't, in order to operate in functional fair and balanced, it needs to be separated from anything that could be construed as having leverage over it. This is why the city was set up as a separate piece, a separate area, one that is odd, I'll admit, in comparison to the states. But the idea, again, was to make absolutely certain that not one particular entity could have control over it. Okay, so the idea of taking the District of Columbia and adding it as a state, there's a couple ideas that are out there that could make this more fair. And I'm going to go ahead and pop up the phone number in case anybody wants to discuss this. But there could be a couple of options where we could make this kind of fair. One being that, and this just popped into my head as I was talking, but one thing could be if it's not an effectual power grab, But it is an effectual representation of the people there because it is designed to be a separate but equal, separate area for power not to be given to one side or another. How about they have to have, in terms of their representatives, they get one out of, since we're a two-party system, one out of the Republican Party and one out of the Democrat Party, rather than having both being elected by the Democrat Party or both being elected by the Republican Party, depending upon which way you want to go. Another option that actually Ben Shapiro kicked out was basically this. If you want them to have representation, if your whole object in doing this is to make sure that you have representation, not necessarily giving them a statehood, but take the actual landmass area that DC encompasses and the part that's in Maryland, have them vote for Maryland's representatives, and the part that's in Virginia, have them vote for Virginia's representatives. And that just makes it easy all around. That makes it to where now you have an area that could vote for their representative in the Senate and the House of Representatives, but it also makes it non-power grab. It makes it a non-starter when it comes to a power grab, because now we still have the 50 states. We still have the balance of power, not necessarily in one political party's hands, because it's pretty obvious that, DC as a state is potentially going to make it to where they have political parties, in this case being the Democrats, gaining 2 more seats in the Senate to have the balance of power shift that way. Kind of makes for an interesting conundrum when you think about where we're going to go with the future. But understanding the past and the history, and understanding the Constitution and the reasons for and the reasons why the framers wanted a separate place, sort of kind of burst the bubble, to be honest with you, to bring in the idea of voting, to bring in an additional state. Now, you could look at things like, for an example, let's look at some of our territories that we have, like Guam and Puerto Rico. As an example, Puerto Rico in particular is the next one that happens to be on the Democrats' list to bring it in as a state. Now, ironically for that, the thing that's funny there is I've seen statistics that the actual people of Puerto Rico have had the opportunity to apply for statehood and have refused it, because they have actual benefits of not being part of the states. That even though they are still a territory covered by us, they do have some benefits. And to be honest with you, I can't really name those right off the top of my head. But it seems kind of strange that if you're advocating for statehood for Puerto Rico, the Puerto Rican residents are like, no, we want to stay separate and independent, even though they have the opportunity to vote in our presidential elections. Same thing goes with any of these other places like Guam or the Virgin Islands or any of these other American-held territories. As to why we wouldn't apply them as a state, there might be some benefit to not being a state. But this is interesting in the fact that the Democrats are definitely, one of the things that they ran on was the idea that they weren't going to push for DC to be a state, and yet here they are. They're pushing for the District of Columbia to be a state. I think I've kind of shown a little bit about where the history comes from, and in terms of there's valid reasons as to why the district is set up that way. Okay. It's set up in that fashion for that particular, position, was mainly to make sure that not any one given state or any one given outside entity could be gaining control over our federal government seat of power. All right. So I have roughly about 15 minutes or so left to the hour. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to another topic that I'm kind of invested in, and invested in the standpoint of, this is something that just doesn't make sense. And I don't know if you've seen this or not, but there's a school district in Virginia that has decided that what they are going to do is they are going to essentially remove advanced mathematics from their curriculum up to the 11th grade. Now, I kind of took a look at this, and I looked on their website to try and see how they are framing it and phrasing it. And honestly, the first bullet point in their phrasing had to deal with equity. They wanted equity. And I'm going to be honest with you. I personally think that there are certain areas where you can't necessarily have an equity of outcome. Okay. There is a bit of a disparaging difference in training, and I get that. And that's a problem or a challenge in other places. That has to deal with, the individual teachers, and I'm not blaming them. I'm not, the individual curriculums. There is a lot of issues that we could take on in the school district, but taking out advanced curriculum in the process, I think it's a bad idea. I kind of have been against the whole No Child Left Behind, only from the idea that as an instructor, because I have done college instruction in the past, as an instructor, my job is to make absolutely certain that all of my students can understand and learn the material. And if they are struggling, then my job is to modify the way that I am teaching in order for them to actually learn. So I need to keep you, for people who are listening to this, I need you to keep that kind of framework in mind. And there are things that are out there, such as learning disabilities and, attention span disorders and things of that nature, medical reasons that are struggling. You could also have physiological, physical, and emotional reasons. I mean, there's a whole gamut of stuff. So this is a really wide, broad topic in its entirety. But from the specifics, I personally think that we are actually doing a disservice by not allowing some students to gain the help that they need by basically forcing the idea that everybody has to pass. Everybody has to move through. And I'm sorry, but there is nothing that is out there in my perception. There are certain aspects of humans where some humans are better at some things and some humans are not. They just aren't. Whether it's physical prowess, whether it's comprehension, whether it's mathematics, whether it's science understanding, there is no way. We have way too much diversity in our world. And the human being, the human species, there is way too much diversity to basically say that everybody has to be the exact same. And unfortunately, that's kind of the frame set that a lot of these people are pushing when they give the idea that we have to have equity of outcome, that everybody has to be the same when they come out. And that just doesn't make sense to me. And it's not that I'm trying to pick on any individual group or anything else, because there are people who are out there who I can tell you are stronger and faster than others. There are people out there who just think with numbers faster and better than others. There are those that are in tune to the arts and are, they are musically inclined, they're artistically inclined, they can see colors with and be able to draw. That's the part that makes up our society and our and the human species as a whole, as an incredible piece of the world. And to punish the fact that there might be some people in a learning environment who learn things faster, understand things better in terms of mathematics in particular, I think is hampering the development of not only those gifts and those talents and abilities, but it's also hampering us in terms of the country as a whole, because of the fact that we've been, one of the things that has been harped on over the years is the fact that the United States has been falling back in the areas of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So you have the STEM group, and everybody's been complaining over the fact that American children are falling behind in comparison to the rest of the world in this case. And this is part of the reason why, because we're not fostering more advanced, challenging programs to help foster those abilities, to push these children into, especially where they have talents and abilities beyond what the normal person would be. I mean, think about it this way. If Thomas Edison had not been allowed to do the things that he was doing, the man was arguably, one of the most smartest people in our history. But if he wasn't allowed to do the things that he was doing because of the fact that he was so much of a expanded thinker than the rest of the world at the same time, we wouldn't have some of the inventions and some of the breakthroughs that man was able to do. And, same thing goes with Hedy Lamarr as an example. So Hedy Lamarr, for those of you that don't know, and the only reason why I really know this is because she was actually an actress, a very, very stunning woman for the day. And a lot of men looked upon her as being, oh, she's just a woman, because that was the attitudes during the time that she was alive. But one of the things that a lot of people don't understand is she was actually instrumental in coming up with developing things like in particular, the frequency hopping spread spectrum technology, which a lot of people are like, huh? What the heck is that? That developed into Wi-Fi. That's what developed into Wi-Fi that all of our tablets and our laptops and everything else that is out there. She was one of the pioneers in the field, working with the U.S. government. She was a brilliant woman. She was just beyond. I mean, she's one of those people that were kind of in the same realm as Thomas Edison, and she created the whole frequency hopping spread spectrum technology for the U.S. government, which later has turned into Wi-Fi as a technology, along with some other technologies. And in terms of her abilities, if she had been allowed to expand, just imagine what she could have done. And that's where I'm kind of sitting here today, and I'm looking at this and I'm saying, wait a minute, why are we trying to hamper people from doing extraordinary things, be it physical or mental? Why are we trying to hamper these people? We should be encouraging this. This isn't something that should happen. And it doesn't matter just because it seems like a good idea on paper or theory doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to do anything in the long run. And unfortunately, we need to start focusing on some other things other than trying to take away the advanced programs that we do have. We need to focus on things for, the lower, the learners that need the additional assistance. And I say the lower, but a lot of people think of things like learning being like a lower class is harder to learn in. And that may be true based on the environment because, let's admit, some schools are just substandard in the long run. But we need to focus on those substandard schools. We need to push them. We need to get them further up. We need to push them and get them into a better position. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we should take away advanced programs just to try and make it to where everybody is learning the same, because that's not right either. Okay, so I've got 5 more minutes left on the clock here for my hour. I do want to, I'm going to go ahead and end with this. I'm going to end with a joke. And the reason why I'm going to end with a joke is because I don't want you guys to go walking away without having some kind of funny here. But I'm going to end with a joke. And, wow, I just noticed that YouTube for me is like jumping, but I don't see any issues. So hopefully it's going clear for you guys. So anyway, my son, during my prep work this tonight, he's got a hell of a sense of humor. I'm gonna have to be honest with you. He's kind of a chip off the old block and try and have some dad jokes all the time and that kind of thing. But he came in and he told me this joke. He said, the inventor of the umbrella was actually going to call it just the umbrella, but he paused. Take that as you will. That's a groaner for sure. Anyway, that's my final Whiskey Musings thought. Do me a favor, if you like what I'm putting out, if you like the videos, please make sure you subscribe. Definitely hit that bell button so that you know when I go live or when I upload a video. I've got a couple of new things coming up. I've got a really good anticipation here, probably within the next few episodes here. I've got a really good interview I'm priming for. Anyway, I appreciate everything I appreciate all of you. And like I said, do me a favor, hit the subscribe button. Don't forget that a lot of your video people that are out there, a lot of your content creators are doing a lot of this on, low budgets and everything else. It's a lot of work, folks. It really is. So do everything you can to support these folks, whether it's me or it's Addie or anybody else that you're watching and making note of, putting in things like thumbs ups, putting in things like, if they have the ability to do, the monetary aspect where you can send them super chats or whatever it is, help support these people. These people are doing a lot of this stuff. And in some cases, they're not actually, in most cases, they're not professionals. So please take the time to support them. Thank you very much for listening. And I will see you next time on the Whiskey Musings broadcast. Good night, everyone.